Today on the Perception and Action podcast, how do coaches pick up information while observing an athlete? How can coaches better educate their attention to information that will help guide the athlete's search and self-organization of movement? A look at perceptual expertise in coaching. So it's time for a call to action. Hello, and thanks for joining me. This is Rob Gray from Arizona State University. I've been on a now over 25-year journey as a researcher, professor, and high-performance consultant to understand how we acquire and adapt our perceptual motor skills. Welcome to the Perception and Action podcast, where I discuss how psychological research can be applied to improving performance, accelerating skill acquisition, and designing technologies. If you're a coach or an instructor, my goal is to help you bridge the gap between research and application, and to connect your experiential knowledge with skill acquisition and motor learning theory. I want to help take you from using practice design recipes to becoming a master chef who can manipulate the key ingredients to come up with your own innovative training methods. If you're a student or fellow academic working in the skill acquisition field, I hope to keep you up to date on the latest studies and help you get to know the people working in this area. Finally, if you're developing training technologies, I hope to help you incorporate good motor learning principles in your design, pull out key performance metrics from the data, and design effective studies to evaluate your product. To learn more, help support the podcast, and/or work directly with me, please check out perceptionaction.com. Now on to the show. In today's episode, I want to look at information pickup and education of attention from a coach's perspective. If you think about it, picking up the right information and using it in the right way is as critical for a coach as it is for an athlete. And when they do it live in practice, there are some similar constraints as those faced by the athlete. The unfolding movement that is being viewed can be very fast and have a very short duration. Also, similar to the problem faced by the athlete, the differences in movement and posture they are looking for can be incredibly small. And indeed, it has been shown, for example, that physical therapists can reliably detect a 2% change in trunk posture, a value substantially smaller than that of an untrained observer. To quote a paper by Giblin and colleagues I will discuss later in the episode, the ability to accurately perceive movement patterns is a critical skill that many observers spend countless hours refining. Highly refined visual perceptual skill is particularly important in sports, where coaches are continually observing and evaluating the movement patterns of their athletes to provide feedback and facilitate skill acquisition and reacquisition. End quote. What are good coaches actually picking up when they're observing an athlete, and how are they using this information? Traditionally, of course, this process of perceptual expertise in coaching has been conceptualized as a coach looking for flaws or errors in the technique based on their own internal mental model of the correct technique. Is there an alternative way to think about this? If the coach's goal is to support exploration and self-organization instead of correcting around an ideal, what should they be looking for? Is there a way we can coach the coach and educate their attention to information from the athlete that will better support providing transition rather than corrective feedback? In this episode, I'm going to start from the traditional internal model-based view, talk about some related research studies, then move to an alternative ecological approach to perceptual expertise in coaching. As I mentioned, the traditional view of what a coach is doing when observing an athlete has been cast in terms of mental models and schema. This conceptualization is nicely captured in a 1992 paper by Pinheiro and Simon, in which they present a model of what they call motor skill diagnosis. In the paper, they start by emphasizing the importance of a coach being able to distinguish between process and performance outcome or product. Quote, observing the product can only make limited contribution to diagnosing motor skills. Accurate description and evaluation of moving body segments is essential to the overall analytic process. The time, sequential joint motion, and other biomechanical features of the process are major sources of information for diagnosing skills correctly. It is the process, good form, that results in good performance outcome. Even though some performers may compensate for so-called deviations, idiosyncratic techniques adopted by the individual through extensive practice, speed of movement and strength training, improper form may diminish the ultimate level of performance. End quote. So I think you can see from that quote, the idea here is that there is a correct technique with maybe some small acceptable bandwidth around it to allow for individual variation. To capture this idea, the authors appeal to the same concept used to explain motor control from an information processing approach: schema. Like in Schmidt's model of motor control, a coach's memory schema contains general information about the different stages of the movement they are observing that is based on past experience and allows for the interpretation of new information when observing an athlete. For example, to quote the paper, the expert shot put coach recognizes that a performer is not standing in the preferred place, which cues information in the memory schema about where he should be standing. End quote. For those that might be interested, I recently posted a video of Schmidt's schema theory on my YouTube channel. Link in the show notes. Pinheiro and Simon are using it here for essentially the same reasons. First, a memory schema, that is an internal model for a general class rather than one specific action, allows some novelty and variation. Second, it avoids the storage problem. That is, a coach having to need a separate mental model of every possible variation of the technique they're coaching. As Schmidt once said, a schema provides a reference correctness rather than a specific recipe for the movement. Early research on perceptual expertise in coaching found that, not surprisingly, the schema of an expert coach is much more elaborate as compared to a novice. For example, Pinheiro's research on shot put coaches found that for the same video sequence, experts identified 12 cues to errors in performance, while novices identified only 5 on average. From this, expert coaches generated more feedback comments, 6 as opposed to only 2 from the novices. The cues novices picked up tended to also be very superficial. I'll talk more about research comparing expert and novice coaches shortly. Where do these schema come from? Pinheiro and Simon identify a variety of sources, including an ideal technique from a textbook, evaluation based on one's own experience as an athlete and coach, norms from professional journals, knowledge of a particular elite performer, for example, the world record holder in your sport, and finally, information from biomechanical analyses. Quote, a coach develops over a period of years a model of the ideal technique that can be compared to the actual techniques of athletes to arrive at diagnostic decisions. During observation, a discrepancy in the performance from the norm provides a click of recognition and evokes information from memory that identifies the errors that cause the deviation. In sum, diagnostic ability can be defined as the ability to recognize variations from a schema in visually presented examples of a motor skill. To make a diagnosis is to compare the problematic technique profile with a standard profile in long-term memory, drawn from all the information available as a result of experience and learning. End quote. In the paper, the authors develop a model of motor skill diagnosis that incorporates 3 major processes: cue acquisition, cue interpretation, and diagnostic decision. Note importantly the use of the word cue here. It is consistent with the indirect perception nature of this internal model approach. That is, the coach is not picking up information which directly specifies what needs to be changed about the technique, but rather they're getting cues or clues that need to be interpreted and processed in order to be used. Of course, I will get to an information-based direct perception view of this later. The first stage of their model involves acquiring cues that can trigger the recognition process in the schema. The cues are comprised of spatial and temporal patterns from the movement, and, quote, the choice of cues is not arbitrary or random, but is based on systematic observation of the motor skill, looking specifically for discrepancies between the actual performance and the ideal model, end quote. Similar to the challenge faced by the athlete, when observing a live execution, the coach needs to use their mental model to know where to look and when to pick up these cues. The second stage of the model, cue interpretation, involves finding possible meanings for the cues through processes of extrapolation and interpolation. That is, the coach is using their memory store of previously experienced executions to interpret the new one they're observing. Something like, previously when I've seen an athlete fly open like this, it's because they're not rotating enough. Again, this is very similar to Schmidt's motor control theory, in that the coach does not necessarily have to have seen the specific technical flaw before in order to be able to diagnose it. They can do this by extrapolating from previous observations. The third and final stage involves making inferences about the specific technical error observed and generating feedback or a new practice activity to correct it. Finally, the authors discuss how novice coaches can develop their schema for motor skill diagnosis. Quote, it is not enough to learn what good technique is. That knowledge can be attained from many sports how-to books and videos. Novice coaches must learn what to look for, which phase of the skill is crucial for performance, and what errors performers are likely to commit. Possession of schemas containing such knowledge reduces the load on the expert's short-term memory, which otherwise will be overloaded with unnecessary information." End quote. So let's look at some research that has examined visual expertise in coaching. In 2015, Smith and colleagues conducted a study to look at information skilled coaches picked up from observing golfers, and how this aligned with knowledge and models from biomechanical studies of golf. Again, they use a very information processing view of what is involved. Quote, "An important aspect of coaching involves the analysis of sporting movements in order to effective change in performance. Coaches are required to make accurate and reliable observations of a performer's movement patterns and subsequently guide their performance towards a more optimal or ideal technique through appropriate coaching sessions. To do this, it is assumed that coaches have a well-developed internal model of a technically correct performance against which they compare the performer's technique. The formation of such a model is proposed to be influenced by several aspects, including a coach's technical knowledge, which includes their biomechanical understanding of the technique." End quote. For the study, 16 high-level golf coaches participated. All had level 3 PGA qualification or higher, at least 5 years of coaching experience, and all had coached at least one tour player. Methodology involved a combination of observing a coach during a session with a player and interviews. What was found? Overall, there was a tendency for coaches to break the swing into phases. For example, ensuring that the key technical parameters were correct and repeatable at setup was important for most coaches. Another important stage identified was the top of the backswing, which was defined in 2 different ways by coaches. The first definition was when the golfer felt they could not rotate their shoulders any further, and the second was when the club had stopped and they begun moving again. But interestingly, there were a few deviations between the coach's knowledge and the biomechanical descriptions of a golf swing. In particular, coaches did not use some of the stages used in biomechanics and often defined them in different ways. Such differences between coaches' knowledge and biomechanical descriptions has also been found in a few other studies. For example, the ice hockey study I discussed in episode 82. There were also some comments by coaches that recognized the limitation of breaking down the swing into stages, instead focusing on the action as a whole. Quote, "I think there are crucial elements like setup and impact, so I do break down elements, but I try to have drills that help promote motion, movement, rhythm, and tempo. I don't like to see players who are transfixed about getting clubs in a position. It's a movement." End quote. The problem with a lot of the biomechanical analysis systems are they generally track what it's like at the start or the end of the movement. But how has that happened is more important. End quote. There were also some comments that reflected the importance of coordination instead of individual positions and postures. Quote, "The coaches believed that the separation between the trunk and pelvis was more important than the independent rotations of these segments. Many of the coaches spoke about dissociation, resistance, storing power, and separation." End quote. So for me, this study hints at something I'm going to discuss more later. Skilled coaches are picking up some higher order information about the swing. In terms of it as a whole and relevant to coordination of different body segments, rather than just employing a biomechanical internal model to pick up simple cues to evaluate their athletes. In a study just recently published, Fedosovia and colleagues examined expertise differences in coaches' observation and knowledge. Again, the authors are starting from an information processing perspective. Quote, "Coaches' technical knowledge is the internal model of a technically correct motion against which coaches compare the actual performance. The internal model consists of chunks of knowledge about sport technique that are linked and learnt from experience." End quote. These chunks are essentially analogous to the cues that Pinheiro and Simon talked about in their model. The idea is that coaches pick up basic sources of information, angles, positions, speeds, and then construct an internal model of technique from these pieces. In their study, Fedosovia et al. Used a mixed method approach, combining interviews and think-aloud protocols with tennis coaches. 8 coaches, 4 expert high-performance coaches from Tennis Australia and 4 novice junior development coaches participated. Experts had at least 10 years of experience, while novices had at least 1 year. From the interviews and comments, the authors constructed descriptions of the internal models of tennis technique separately for the 2 groups. What was found? Well, there was a lot in common. There were some elements in the models that were different for each group. For example, experts mentioned hip rotation while novices talked about twists, suggesting that the latter has a more superficial elements in their model. The expert model had a total of 7 categories of technical elements, while the novice had only 6, consistent with the idea that expertise increases the elaboration of the model. Expert coaches demonstrated greater use of biomechanical terms, for example, describing body angles and degrees, and biomechanical knowledge. Finally, experts showed more use of what the authors called reasoning chains, in which they connected different components together in a causal relationship. For example, they talked about, quote, twist across the torso and elastic energy and get up on the ball, end quote. So the knowledge was not just about the key technical components, but also how they work together to coordinate the movement. To quote the authors, tennis coaching expertise is determined by the ability to understand the functionality of the serve, application of biomechanical principles to technique, understanding the connection between different technical elements and its relationships, the ability to see the movement as a whole rather than separate parts. This conclusion aligns with the constraints-led approach, end quote. I'm not quite sure what the authors mean by this aligns with the CLA, but for me, again, it suggests that skilled coaches are not just detecting chunks and cues, but instead are attuned to higher order information about the whole movement. Finally, the authors consider why these expertise differences exist. First, there's obviously a difference in the training and coach education that comes through the certification process. An interesting second reason they suggest is a difference in the athletes they typically work with. That is, because expert coaches typically work with higher performance players, they identify different factors specific to that level. The authors suggest this could be remedied by allowing novice coaches to work or apprentice with higher level athletes on some occasions. Another possible reason why coaching observation and knowledge might differ between coaches could be differences in playing experience in their sport. This issue was investigated in a study by Giblin and colleagues in 2016. As I discussed at the start of the episode, the challenge of picking up perceptual information is similar in many ways for an athlete and coach. Therefore, to quote the authors, given that in many sports the coaches are past performers of the activity for which they now coach, it is interesting to ascertain whether the perceptual cognitive skills of coaches are in any way related to the extent of their experience and expertise in physically performing the skills in which they now instruct others. Prince's common coding theory suggests that observers should be more perceptually attuned to actions that they have actually had experience performing. And this view is supported by neural evidence from mirror neurons that activate when observing or producing a specific action. On this basis, it is possible that coaches with a previous playing background, i.e. with motor experience, may have an advantage over those that do not when it comes to perceptually discriminating changes in movement patterns. End quote. To address this question, the authors recruited 41 participants that were split into 4 groups. 2 groups of tennis coaches, 1 expert and 1 novice, without a previous history of high-level playing experience. So both of these groups have perceptual but not motor expertise. The third group were high-level coaches that also played at a high level in their career, so they had both types of expertise. The final group were players without any coaching experience, so with only motor expertise. The experimental task involved watching pairs of videos of serves and being asked to answer 2 questions. 1, were the 2 videos the same or different? And 2, if they were different, what was different about them? For this second question, participants were given 3 choices: knee flexion, trunk rotation, and ball position during the serve. Motion tracking equipment was used to create videos in which these things were changed by different magnitudes. For example, there were videos with 6 different knee flexion angles. Finally, in an interesting addition to the study, point-like biological motion displays were also created, and participants were asked to perform the same task. In such displays, where you only see dots moving around on the screen, there is only kinematic information available to make the judgments. What was found? Previous playing experience, that is motor expertise, did not convey any significant advantage at all. In fact, all groups in the study had roughly the same level of performance in the task. The only real difference was that expert coaches, both those that played at a high level and those that didn't, were better at detecting changes in knee flexion as compared to novice coaches and players. Quote, collectively, the findings demonstrate that experienced coaches have the capacity to detect relatively small changes in kinematics. However, the ability to detect changes does not appear to be influenced by the extent of their own expertise in producing the movement pattern being evaluated." End quote. Interestingly, the main variable that was significant in the study was the display type, with all groups performing worse with the point light displays than with the full videos, again suggesting the use of more complex information than simple kinematics. Before turning to an alternative view, I want to discuss one more study that examined an explanation for perceptual expertise differences in coaches. In a study published in 2020, Waters and colleagues explored whether the gaze behavior of coaches might change with experience. Given the importance of looking in the right place at the right time for athletes, it would seem likely that this is also a part of effective coaching. In the study, 22 sprint coaches, 10 experts with more than 10 years of experience and high-level accreditation, and 10 novice coaches were compared to 12 sport biomechanists with no coaching experience. Participants were asked to make verbal commentaries about sprinting technique while watching videos played at 2 different speeds, real time and slow motion with a 10% reduction in speed. While doing this, their gaze behavior was measured with an eye tracker. The videos created were of athletes from a range of different skill levels and from 2 different sports, rugby and track and field. The fastest speed for each athlete was used in the video, with accelerations and decelerations edited out. In previous studies, and similar to some of the findings I've already discussed today, it has been shown that coaches and biomechanists discuss different things when describing sprint technique, with the former focusing more on the upper body and the latter more on the lower body. Therefore, it was predicted that this would affect where the 2 different groups looked when watching the video. What was found? There were no significant group differences in gaze behavior. The only factor that was of influence was the playback speed, with participants not surprisingly making more fixations for slow motion. There was also some evidence that participants were using a visual pivot point strategy when viewing the full speed videos. That is, they were keeping their eyes fixed on one point so that they could view the body motions in peripheral vision. For a discussion of how athletes seem to use this same strategy, check out episode 154. Thus, overall, and as the authors discuss, these findings don't really seem to support the idea that coaching observation is driven by an internal mental model. If this were the case, we would have expected to see clear gaze behavior differences as a function of skill level and between coaches and biomechanists. A final thing to point out that Waters and colleagues discuss nicely is that almost all studies on perceptual expertise in coaching don't make the connection between the observation technique by the coach on the one hand and actual performance on the other. Yes, the expert coaches may see and comment on different things in these studies, but do these things actually relate to performance? In one of the few studies to do this, a study published by Sparrow in 1992, it was found that there was no difference in the ability of expert versus novice coaches to estimate the handicap of a golfer from observing their technique. However, in a different study by Lees and Chi, experienced coaches' ratings of the overall movement of swimmers was significantly correlated with their times in the pool. So in sum, I think there's some limitations with this assumption that coaches use a schema of the ideal technique to guide observation of cues from an athlete's movement and construct an internal model for giving instruction and feedback. And of course, the idea that there is a correct technique stored in a coach's memory is not really consistent with an ecological approach in which it's not believed there is one ideal. So what is the alternative? Well, to start with, we need to move away from the idea that the goal of observing the athlete is to provide corrective feedback. As I discussed in a recent video review of Felton and colleagues' study of optimizing cricket bowling technique, see the link in the show notes, it is near impossible to identify beforehand what the optimal technique will be for a given athlete because it depends on their intrinsic dynamics, that is, their natural coordination tendencies, which we really don't have a good access to. So instead of trying to set a goal of an optimal movement pattern and correct around it, coaches should really be focusing on providing what Newell calls transition feedback. That is feedback that helps guide the athlete's exploration to find their unknown self-optimal. So the feedback is about whether the search is in a good direction rather than about the technique itself. Correcting to an optimal can also lead to a coach providing feedback that an athlete is not actually able to use and could result in you steering them towards a coordination pattern they cannot actually achieve due to their intrinsic dynamics. These ideas are echoed in the conclusion to the Giblin et al. Paper I discussed earlier. Quote, Although the present study suggests that coaches are quite sensitive to small changes in knee flexion and ball toss positioning, it will be critical to consider the importance or impact of these changes. Movement production is inherently variable, with small changes in kinematics often being present despite successful skill execution. From an ecological dynamics perspective, movement variability helps an individual athlete to adapt to unique constraints and facilitates flexible coordination tailored to specific environmental or task demands. As a coach, it is crucial to consider whether changes in kinematics are functionally variable or whether significant errors are likely to affect skill execution. Increased sensitivity to changes in movement kinematics is likely to be redundant if a coach is unable to perceive the difference between inherent variability and authentic skill errors. Furthermore, it is also critical to consider the corresponding sensitivity of performers to implement kinematic changes in their movement patterns. For instance, if visual sensitivity is superior to the performance kinesthetic sensitivity, any feedback provided at the most precise level of visual sensitivity will be beyond the level that performers can use effectively. For this reason, it will be critically important in future studies to also consider the visual system and the kinesthetic system together when assessing the likely efficacy of feedback provided by coaches." End quote. So in other words, we need to take into account the adaptability of movement solutions and functional variability, and that just because a coach can see a small difference in the arm angle, for example, relative to some reference in memory, this information might actually be of no use to an athlete using different information about their body position. This can be seen in the studies I reviewed previously in episodes 65 and 78. An athlete's ability to use feedback from biomechanical analyses, or implement changes from explicit instructions like contact the ball 20 centimeters more forward or bend your knees 20 degrees more, is very limited. Just because a coach or biomechanist has sensitivity to detect these differences does not mean they are useful information for the athlete. Also, as we could see in some of these studies I talked about today, in many cases, coaches seem to be using higher order information about the whole movement that they can't easily put into words. A good alternative account of the perceptual expertise involved in coaching was expressed in a paper published in 2001 by Sparrow and Sherman. Here, the authors used Newell's coordination model, rather than an internal model or schema, to conceptualize the process. Quote, "Newell has recognized that the natural nominal categorization of activities is determined by the invariant characteristics of the relative motions of the body and limbs. Indeed, by elaboration, it may be proposed that each physical activity is defined behaviorally by a unique set of topological properties of relative motions." End quote. The controlling or scaling of the coordination pattern, performing the movement faster or slower, for example, is another critical feature in making decisions about the quality of the movement pattern. In summary, the assessment of movement patterns involves two tasks: determining the shape or topology of the movement pattern, as defined by coordination, and evaluating the scaling or control. Again, this is very different from the idea that a coach should be looking for cues in the form of small deviations in movement from an ideal technique stored in memory. Detecting the topology of coordination and scaling will again require the use of higher order information as opposed to simple positions and joint angles. So how can a coach develop the ability to pick up these higher order information sources from an athlete's movement patterns and use it to provide transition feedback? Well, similar to an athlete, they need to educate their attention to these information sources through practice. And just like with the athlete, this will be facilitated by adding variability to the observation conditions, viewing from different angles, different body types, different ages, and skill levels. As Sparrow and Sherman discussed, the goal is to learn to pick up topologies and scaling rather than specific cues. Another really effective thing I like to use, even though I'm not really a coach, is what I like to call a diagnostic constraints manipulation. When we manipulate constraints in practice, we typically do it for the purpose of getting the athlete to try something different in their movement solution. But I think they can also be used by a coach to educate their attention to information from the athlete's movement. So the idea here is to add a specific constraint, like a heavier bat or a wider stance, not so much to help the athlete find a coordination solution, but rather to provide you, the coach, information about how they're exploring the perceptual motor space. How do they move when you add weight, shorten time, or increase space? I think this can be a really effective way to provide transition feedback, which remember is about how they're exploring, not about how they're performing. Okay, that's it for today's episode. Remember, you can contact me at robgray@asu.edu or follow me on Twitter at ShakyWeights. To find out more about the podcast, please check out perceptionaction.com. Finally, to support the podcast and receive bonus materials, including written transcripts, please head over to patreon.com/perceptionaction. This is Rob Gray from ASU. Cheers for now, and keep 'em coupled.
Gone straight away.